Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jamie Vogel. I'm the VP of Sales and Marketing for Transportation Impact. Welcome to the next episode of Let's Talk Ship discussion series. Today, we'll be discussing how to understand the fine print in your small parcel carrier agreement. It's a lot more complicated than you might think. We encourage you to ask questions by utilizing the question section of the GoToWebinar pane, and we promise we'll take time to answer as many as we can at the conclusion of the discussion. I have two guests today, both from the Transportation Impact team, Brandon Burt, Director of Operations, and Jay Yoakley, our Director of Sales. Welcome, guys. Thanks for joining me.
Good afternoon.
Thanks, Jamie. Appreciate you having us.
Yeah. So I invited you both because not only do you bring some unique experience, but the two of you are helping almost every single one of our customers navigate their agreements. Brandon, you started here 7 years ago as an analyst, and now you're director of your team, and you touch just about everything. And Jay, you and your team are client-facing, giving clients that guidance and knowledge every single day. So what I want to do today is quickly build up to how a shipper can better understand the somewhat confusing and fine print, because there's no shortage of that in carrier agreements, as you guys know. So let's start with something that might sound maybe elementary, but this is something that we actually have to help clients navigate. Where can a shipper even find their carrier agreement? Can they log into a carrier portal and see it, or where should they look?
That's a great question, Jamie. It's important for us specifically when we are entertaining discussions with our prospects. The first step in our process is to analyze their current pricing. And so a lot of times we have to help our clients identify where they can find that carrier agreement for their business. And that really ranges depending on the company, who the client is, oftentimes depending on the size of the company. You can find it sometimes in finance department, procurement, operations, even sometimes in the legal departments. It's oftentimes by a higher ranking individual. And then often, with smaller companies, maybe the owner handles that agreement specifically, keeps it on their desks. But it really varies depending on the size of the shipper and who the client is.
Got you. So the short answer is sometimes it isn't always easy to find. And the reason why we brought this up, right, is because we coach our clients to maybe avoid asking the carrier for their agreement, especially if they're about to open a negotiation without having a strategy to back up the ask. So all right, so they find the agreement. What's next? Before a shipper even starts to read the agreement, are there things they need to know first?
Yeah, there's a handful of important things that a shipper should understand before even diving into the specifics of their carrier agreement. And first and foremost, it's really understanding their own operational process. Knowing the packages that they're shipping, the size, are they bulky, heavy packages? Are they lightweight shipments? Which networks are they utilizing with the carrier? Heavy air shipments, heavy ground shipments? Is it the commercial network, the residential network? So really, first and foremost, understanding their business specifically, right? What services are they using? What do their packages look like? And what are the products that they're shipping? And then with that being said as well, they need to understand, what kind of volume they are shipping with those products. What is their gross and annual net spend with the carrier? What are the published charges that they're, taking on in their agreement? And also the rolling average is very important because, inside of carrier agreements, before they even get in and look at what their pricing is, it's all going to be tier based. And they're going to be placed in those tiers based on rolling averages. So it's important to understand, how much they're shipping, what they're shipping, and what their spend dynamics are, so that they can take that information and apply that to understand exactly how that pricing is going to relate to them specifically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. Brandon, I know you had a couple things to add there too.
Yeah, is equally as important to the things that Jay has said here. It's important to understand when this agreement was signed. Plenty of incentives within the agreement. Additional addendums, all of these, aspects of doing business with these two large carriers here, they can change, as you get further and further away from the effective date of this agreement. So rebates and surcharges can expire in this time. You can have addendums that are executed in this time. It's important to know who signed it. It's important to know, sometimes that person may not be with the company, but it's important to know who signed it because you can get some idea of why was this agreement signed. Was it from carrier pressure? Was it an internal initiative to cut costs on large contracts? But the main point is knowing really, hey, am I even looking at my full agreement here as well?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I love your point about who signed it. And so many times, to your point, we see and work with clients who have just very old agreements, or maybe even not very old, and the person who signed it no longer works there. There's no background that someone can have. So Brandon, at a high level, because we are already getting questions about this, what are the differences between carrier agreements, the big two most commonly used?
Yeah, so I'd say the main difference, just a very basic example here, is UPS and FedEx, just the formats. FedEx will break out their agreements between their two main operating companies, which are FedEx Ground and FedEx Express. UPS keeps all their services for the most part in one agreement, but UPS can also make things a tad bit more complicated at times when a customer grows or is purchased. The size of a customer spend and the network that a customer has can necessitate a larger agreement where they have a master agreement and addendums get signed over time, or they may go from being on a much smaller regional agreement to a much larger strategic agreement. Other differences include just timing. FedEx, when FedEx offers rebates or deferred incentives, FedEx is going to offer those on a calendar or on a fiscal basis, where hey, day 1 to day 90 is Q1 of that agreement. UPS is actually going to follow a calendar quarter, and that has implications across the organization when you consider accounting and accruals. The money back guarantees and the guaranteed service refund waivers, those will have different formats, different ways of attacking that solution from the different carriers. Same concept, but if a customer wants to keep that in their agreement and they want to switch carriers, they would have to really understand how these two things would relate to one another in the agreements. In addition to that, FedEx contracts can sometimes have a lot more discounts, either in their base or earned discounts, where UPS can do the same, but they may offer a lot more earned discount and really try to give you a lot more bang for your buck on your volume. But it's really important to understand the main formatting differences between the two agreements.
Yeah, definitely. And those are all important reasons shippers need to be able to connect the dots if they're comparing those agreements against one another. They even break out the revenue bands that you referenced. FedEx lays them out in their agreements differently than UPS does. So let's get into the fine print a little bit. I've heard our CEO joking around a couple months ago, and he said, we read these things like Sesame Street books, and it was really funny. But all joking aside, there's a lot to talk about when it comes to confusing and hidden language in these agreements. So Jay, why don't you start us off with giving the audience some specific examples that you've come across?
Yeah, there's so many to talk about, Jamie, and it's one of the most important pieces of the conversations that we have with our clients and prospects in any stage of our partnership is helping them understand what we refer to commonly as the smoke and mirrors inside of these carrier agreements. There are fine-tuned details that really need to be paid attention to, because it's going to impact whether or not you're actually going to receive the discounts that your agreement states. And so it's very important to pay attention to. Some of these, for an example, are minimum commitment thresholds. You might have very specific pricing in your agreement, but in order to achieve that pricing, you have to hit requirements that the carrier puts in place, whether that's daily volume thresholds, weekly volume thresholds, annual volume thresholds. So you have to account for a specific amount of volume with that carrier to actually receive that pricing, or you can be penalized, which is very important to pay attention to. Something that we really help our clients with and make sure that we're keeping them in line and giving them that information to make sure they stay within those thresholds. Another one is a lot of our clients specifically rely heavily on rebates, whether that's quarterly deferred incentives or annual incentives. And those also have thresholds. Shippers must meet certain net transportation charges or volume requirements in order to receive those rebates. So, just because your agreement says that you are entitled to specific pricing or rebate incentives, you have to meet certain thresholds that the carrier is putting in place from a volume standpoint to actually achieve things. And another one that's really big, standard carrier agreements are 156 weeks. And that's one of the reasons why we mirror our partnerships with our clients for that same 3-year term, because we want to be there for the lifetime of that carrier agreement to bring them the value that they deserve and that we want to provide to them. Oftentimes, carriers will sneak in language that will, for example, custom dimensional weight divisors or surcharges, which is where carriers make 40% of their profits. Inside of a standard 3-year agreement, the carrier might put in there that dim divisor or surcharges expire after 52 weeks or after the first 2 years. So a client needs to pay attention to that, as shippers do, to understand, to make sure that they're going to be receiving the full benefit of these surcharges and these custom dim weight divisors for the full lifetime term of their agreement. Because if you have a 156-week agreement and your dim expires or your surcharges expire after the first year or second year, you are without a doubt taking on a hefty price increase for the remainder of that contract. So little things like that are important to pay attention to.
Yeah, and our clients find it really hard to calculate some of that on their own, particularly as it relates to rebates, right? Because not every service or charge that you're charged is relative to that threshold to receive your rebate. In many cases, SurePost and SmartPost are not calculated when they go to calculate your rebate. Minimums and some other specific surcharges are just not included. And so you have to pay really close attention to those things.
Absolutely.
So we see it a lot. And just a few weeks ago, we had a client come to us. I'm sure you guys remember this. The carrier set an addendum in front of him. He promised that it was $78,000 to $80,000 in savings in the addendum that he was putting in front of the client. And actually, it was a dis savings from where he was, and we had to help him, through that. So I know you guys have a few specific examples of working with our clients that you wanted to share today too. Jay, why don't you kick us off there?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not uncommon for the carrier to walk into a shipper's office and present them with an updated pricing proposal, regardless of the last time that you went through a negotiation. And it's very important for us, and one of the value propositions that we bring to our clients is to make sure that when that does happen, we're there to value that, to determine, what is the real impact of what the carrier is presenting to you. And Jamie, to your point, it's a great case and example. We've seen it more than once where the carrier, has walked into one of our clients' office, presented them with an updating pricing agreement, and stated that it was going to be an advantage for the company. And truth be told, it was actually not. It was very contrary to that. It took the client backwards. And some of the things that we see specifically that has some of the largest impact on spend for shippers is the impact of minimums. And it's a great example that we use with our clients and prospects. And to give you a very simple example of what this is, take ground shipments, and specifically ground residential, which right now is a very hot topic in the marketplace with the shift in the B2C network that we've seen. A client has specific discounts on their ground residential shipments for every weight class that they have, but the impact of minimums are tremendous. So right now, published minimum is $8.23 for FedEx and UPS. Now those are negotiable items, and obviously those are things that we try to identify for our clients to make sure they're market appropriate. But if you take a very simple example, Jamie, of a $10 package that's going to be shipped ground residential, and they have a 50% discount in the 1 to 5 pound weight break, sometimes shippers might think they're going to pay $5 for that package, 50% off of $10. But in reality, if they have a minimum in their agreement that states, whether it's published at $8.23 or whatever that negotiated minimum is, that's what they're paying for that package. So instead of actually realizing a 50% discount, they're only realizing a fraction of that. And we refer to that as contractual discount versus effective discount. There is a clear differentiation between those two. But it's an example of how impactful minimums can be. And we've seen it time and time again where carriers have come in, claim that they're giving better discounts, but what they do is they increase those minimums on the back end, and sometimes shippers don't catch that. And the discount is what they're paying attention to. They might go from 45% to 50%, but it's the minimum they really need to be focused on. So that's one of the things we really try to highlight for our clients specifically. Another one is money back guarantees and GSRs. Another hot item right now. Currently the carriers have suspended this amidst the pandemic that we're in, service failure refunds. With the stretching the capacity right now, they're not giving the opportunity for clients to file for those late deliveries. We do foresee this coming back in the future, but obviously right now it's something that the carriers have taken away. But one of the most common things we see, specifically when carriers come in and try to present a new pricing agreement, is they'll slide that language in there. 9 times out of 10, we see it happen where they'll put, client waives the right to file for service failure refunds. Every shipper has the right to hold a vendor and a partner accountable. And we believe that. And so we always make sure for our clients that we have that language taken out in our negotiations. We make sure that they do have the ability to hold the carriers accountable to get their packages there on time, as they should. So that's something very important. Make sure anytime a carrier walks in and presents something new, that you're taking what you currently have and you're comparing that side by side to what they presented, because there is some fine language in there. Again, the money back guarantees that you need to identify. And last thing I'll touch on, Jamie, is be careful if you are doing a lot of LTL shipments as well. We talk a lot about parcel, but oftentimes if you're shipping both, if you're utilizing FedEx or UPS for your LTL shipments, a lot of these agreements are bundled from a pricing standpoint. So you have to be very wary of how your LTL volume and your parcel volume are, because those are both going to impact the discounts that you're receiving, because it's all based on volume. So if your agreement's bundled, you need to pay attention to both there, because if you move some of that LTL volume elsewhere, it's going to impact your parcel pricing and vice versa. So be careful, identify those things, make sure you're really looking at the fine print.
Those are all really great points. Yeah, go ahead, Brandon.
No, absolutely, Jay. You're reading a rate agreement. You're a shipper reading a rate agreement, hoping to get additional savings or know more about what the future holds and the prices you might be able to charge your customers. But you might lose sight of some of these pretty impactful aspects of your agreement in doing business with the carrier. And oftentimes there's a few that may not even really be in that rate agreement. And maybe they're in the terms and conditions of the rate guide, or maybe they're a softer agreement with the way of doing business with the carrier. So those things being pulled or added into agreements it happens, and for good reason, especially due to the time period we've been experiencing for the last few months. But there's additional things, such as most shippers may not know this, but if you're a shipper and you want to go and negotiate with your carrier, you got to be current on your bills. Or if you're a shipper and it's time for a rebate to be paid, you're into that quarter and you're behind, you may not get that rebate. They may hold that, and again, for good reason. But that's not something you're necessarily agreeing to in your agreement. It's in the fine print. It's not something that you may view as a negotiable. But then then there's other things that the carriers throw in there as well, and there's other. It's important to understand what's the strategic value of certain aspects being in my agreement. So if I'm, for instance, using a program offered by one of the carriers to say, for instance, money for me to get on loan from a carrier to improve my systems to help the carrier, operate my business and volume more profitably or more effectively, and that could be presented to me as, hey, this is good money to take, and we can use this to improve our relationship. And maybe that's actually being used to lock a carrier or a shipper into rates for a long time until they can pay that money back. And everybody knows here how often things can change and how rapidly things can change with shippers or carriers. So you got to be cognizant of, hey, am I going to go and do this with an effort to strengthen my relationship or to cut costs for the carrier myself, but ultimately have this unintended consequence of not being able to get out of this agreement. Early term addendums and term agreements up front are definitely beneficial as well. But it's also important that customers know on that same concept of not exactly knowing the fine print related to these larger aspects that aren't related to a specific rate are your rebates and minimum commitments and signing bonuses. Specifically to the rebates and the signing bonuses, that's a really shiny thing to get up front when you're in the middle of that discussion with your carrier. But let's say you go and you're 2 years into that agreement and your business has declined some, and you get, let's say, an annual rebate, and the carrier wants to give you quarterly advancements on that. Well, you may get your rebate early, you may get your first 2 or 3 advancements, but you may not qualify. Say you just totally tank in Q4, you may not qualify when the carrier goes to aggregate the annual calculation. You may not qualify and actually have to pay some of those rebates back. So those are areas where we can see customers get into a little trouble. It's at times negotiable, but it's we agree to these things up front. The carriers, the customers, they agree to these things up front. So it does become a strategic discussion, and it's very, very important for the customers to know, what am I getting myself into, regardless of the actual rates I'm agreeing to, regardless of the discounts, regardless of the surcharge discounts, the minimums. What else legal T's and C's may I be getting myself into? But that's a major point that we see customers get into trouble with sometimes.
Yeah, those are really great points. The T's and C's and understanding all that. I love that. So we've got a couple of questions coming in from the audience, and there's a couple of questions that are related to one another. So one of our audience members said, I just noticed the dim divisor agreed upon for the first year of the agreement has a validity date period end date prior to when the agreement was signed. Do I have any recourse? That's a good question. Sometimes those things happen in agreements. And so Brandon, do you want to take that one?
Absolutely. So if I'm the carrier, I don't, we put these numbers in here, with a 1-year divisor here, and to extend after that, maybe you go to a list rate there. Maybe you go back to the carrier's stated 139, or maybe you go from maybe a 250 to a 225. When you go from 250 to 225, there's definitely recourse, but you also want to understand that that's not as big of a drop off as like a 250 to a 139. There's always recourse. There is strategic value in waiting, but there's also, hey, if I'm 1 year into a 3-year agreement here, I can always ask that it be extended, or I can help the carrier understand what I'm doing internally through my own habits. If we're better measuring our packages up front, if we're trying to ship less air and kind of re-engineer, use less boxes, ship more, fill those boxes better, get all your orders in one box, or get all your orders to the same customer in one box. To be able to show some of those aspects of what the customer is doing to help the carrier maintain its operating margins there, those will help build that business case and that strategic notion of why you're going to ask for the extension on that dim or that dim discount, or the dim divisor staying high for a longer period.
Or surcharges or anything. And I think the other thing that maybe this shipper in particular can do, if they're able, is maybe try to figure out whether the dim divisor is still being applied. And if it isn't, pick up the phone and call your rep. And if that validity date period end date is prior to even when the agreement was signed, it could really just be a typo. But first step would be just figuring out if it's being applied, and then reaching out to your rep if it isn't. So that was another question that came from the audience. DIMs are big, surcharges often expire sometimes before the agreement ends. So Jay, why don't you take this one? What do you recommend shippers should do strategically, when they find those things in their agreement?
Yeah, great question. And first and foremost, when you find those things in your agreement, it's an automatic that, in our opinion, and what we do for our clients, that you push back to try to have those extended for the lifetime of your agreement. But even more specifically, Jamie, one thing that's very important for shippers to understand is that, although there oftentimes is language that we're referencing to, whether it's your dim divisor or surcharges that expire, whether it's 1 year or 2 years into your agreement, there is also language in there for rate change disclosure terms. And typically those are 30 days. Now, what that means is that, and this is a very common conversation that we have up front with our prospects to make them understand that these are agreements that you have in place with the carrier. These are not contracts. These can be amended at any point in time, just as you as the shipper have that right, the carrier also has the ability to do so as well. We see it, right now we're living it with peak season that the carrier has deemed during the pandemic, adding on surcharges to already existing surcharges inside of agreements. We have the traditional peak season coming up where more price increases will take place, GRIs every year. But the carrier also has the ability to walk in, as we've been, speaking to, and they can lay a new agreement on your desk, and within 30 days, they can change your pricing. So, although there might be language that says these things are going to expire at a certain point in time, it could be any day that the carrier walks in and says, hey, in 30 days, this is what's going to change. Now, we've seen our customers and help them effectively leverage this, where we can have the carrier extend that 30-day language and determine what the impact of this is and strategize around that. But it's very important to note that that language is in there and that those changes can take place very quickly, whether you have expiration dates or not.
Mm-hmm. Great, great point. So that kind of takes us to the end, and no more questions from the audience, it doesn't look like. So this webinar, thank you guys first. Thank you guys so much for spending your time with me this afternoon. I know you both have very busy schedules, so I very much appreciate it.
Absolutely. Glad to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Enjoyed it.
So to our audience, this webinar will be available post this call via our follow-up email, also our website. Those who provided your mailing address will receive a professional Ship Talker pin like we're all wearing here today. If you didn't provide your mailing address, you can simply respond to the follow-up email to receive one. Our next Let's Talk Ship webinar will be Thursday, September the 10th at 1 p.m. And our topic will be how BI can change your shipping game. So we hope to see you professional Ship Talkers there.